Everything that the City of Edmonton does on affordable housing is in partnership, because we don't actually directly deliver housing ourselves. And I would say that extends also to this presentation and paper, which I did in partnership with Jillian Anderson. When I first came into this job that I'm in now, it was in March earlier this year. One of the first repeated phone calls I got was from Sasha saying, "Hi, I'm Sasha. We have this plan for this conference. We need a conference paper from you. It's going to need to be done really quickly, etc., etc." And so, being fairly overwhelmed and brand new to housing, I recruited the efforts of Capital Region Housing, which is where Jillian works, and Jillian and I had worked together previously, and so we decided to work together to produce a paper and a presentation that talks just about sort of the history of affordable housing delivery in Edmonton. So that's what Jillian will cover first in the first part of the presentation, and then I'll speak more about what some of the current initiatives that are underway.
Yeah, okay. So just to give you guys a bit of background on Capital Region Housing, we are the largest provider of social and affordable housing in the Edmonton area. So we're a housing management body that was created under the Alberta Housing Act. And so I think, Sarah, you mentioned some of the punitive regulations, those types of things. We have to follow those for our community housing stock. We manage over 4,500 units of social or community housing and 600 near market units, and then we also administer some rent supplement programs. And so, as Christel said, today we're here to talk about the role that partnerships have played throughout the city's history of involvement in affordable housing, and hopefully give you some takeaways on what has worked well for us in the City of Edmonton. And given some recent changes, as Christel said, we're going to expand a little bit beyond what we wrote about in the paper, because there have been a lot of recent developments in Edmonton over the past couple months. So we can have that to look forward to. So, as a couple of the speakers have previously mentioned, affordable housing development in Canada over the last couple of decades can really be characterized as a patchwork of policy initiatives and various disjointed layers of government funding. There has been essentially no consistency in federal funding since the 1960s or 70s, and public support for affordable and social housing has really varied over the years, and it's fluctuated in line with housing demand. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with the local context here, Edmonton is about 3 hours north of here. The city itself has a population just under 1 million people. And it's home to the second largest population of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And this is a rapidly growing and very young population. And we're also unique, especially compared to Calgary, which you are probably all more familiar with now after hearing about their model here, but the City of Edmonton does not directly develop or manage any affordable housing. So affordable or near market housing is usually offered through different nonprofit organizations or seniors organizations or different arrangements in the private rental market, like our secondary suites program. And as far as social housing, that's generally offered by Capital Region Housing. And so, as I said, we are a housing management body, so we're distinct from the municipal government. And even though we work closely on a lot of projects, and many of our buildings are on city-owned land or sometimes on provincial-owned land, the city does not otherwise manage or provide any housing directly. So in Edmonton as a whole, only about 26% of all our housing units are apartment dwellings, and we also have one of the highest home ownership rates in Canada. So just to give you some context, we are higher than the Canadian average. I think it's about 70% currently. And so there's a lot of primarily single detached homes within our city. Within that context, there's about 18,000 affordable housing units all across the city. And these provide housing to a range of demographic types, from singles to families, senior households, all across the spectrum. And so within this, we have 13,500 non-market affordable housing units, about 4,500 social housing units, and 200 permanent supportive housing units. But despite this inventory, we do still have quite a large supply gap. In the context of the economic boom and bust cycles that we are familiar with here in Alberta, as well as the limited funding terms that often come with federal or provincial funding for housing, and just growing affordability concerns in general across the housing spectrum, we still have a lot of work to do. So in Edmonton, there's nearly 50,000 low-income renter households who are still living in unaffordable housing situations, and around 22,000 of these are experiencing severe affordability challenges. And unfortunately, this number doesn't seem to be shrinking right now. And then a further 1,800 people experience homelessness on any given night in our city. So just to look a bit more at this supply gap, this is what is needed to address the gap in housing for low-income renter households in our city. So Edmonton's first 10-year plan to end homelessness, which I think was released 2007?
2009.
Oh, sorry, 2009. They identified a goal of 1,000 units of permanent supportive housing by 2014. And unfortunately, since that time, only 200 have been built. So there's still quite a large need that remains for that of 916 units. And then as far as the deeply subsidized social housing units, it's just over 25,000. And then the remainder of affordable housing, less deeply subsidized, is around 21,000 units. So over the years, the city has taken on many different roles, and these have been really fluid over time in response to changes in the political or the social and the economic environment. So basically, depending on the era and the context, depending on the economic situation of our city, the level of federal funding or support that we were able to receive, the city has taken on many different roles. So there was a time in the past when the city was the direct developer and manager of affordable housing. The city has taken part in political advocacy efforts. They've provided land or funding to other stakeholders in order to develop housing. In the late 60s, early 70s, we actually were part of a large land banking project that led to Edmonton's first socially planned community. It's very hard to find information about this because apparently it was a secret land banking project at the time, but I think I read that it was the biggest land banking occurrence that had happened in North America at that time. So that, pardon?
The
Millwoods area, yeah. So I think now about 77,000 people live in that neighborhood, so that was quite substantial at the time. And I know they had people like lining up at City Hall days ahead of time to buy land for this, so that, they've done a lot of different things over the years. Setting community priorities and a guiding vision, so being involved in that policy making, facilitating partnerships between external organizations, and then also creating and implementing things like policy, municipal regulations, and different zoning applications. So as a municipality, the city really is quite constrained in what it's able to accomplish alone. As Christel said, essentially every successful initiative that the city has had to date, including some of the more recent developments that Christel's going to talk about, they have occurred as a result of some sort of partnership or collaborative relationship, whether that be with another order of government or community partners. But it should be noted that like other cities, Edmonton has not always been successful in its effort to develop affordable rental housing. After the initial explosion of social housing development that we had in Canada around the 60s to 80s, there are full decades, beginning in the late 80s, that are characterized by basically no new affordable housing development in our city until there was a modest return to development in the mid-2000s. With that being said, we did see some success over the years, and we think it's important to reflect on what has worked well when thinking about planning for the future. So based on the paper that we wrote and some analysis I did, I was able to pull out a series of unique circumstances that contributed to the city's ability to create and foster these partnerships that led to the successful production of rental housing. So I'm just going to briefly touch on these before Christel talks about some of the more recent developments with the city. So since the late 1970s, the city has had a very strong housing policy framework. I believe the first formal housing policy document came out in 1973, and since that time we've pretty much had a consistent stream of policies that the city as a whole and various partners have been able to get behind and follow. So this has really had a dual benefit of keeping housing in Edmonton at the forefront of political concern for several decades, as well as serving as a very important catalyst for collaboration between different partners. So this included focused housing policy documents, as well as some of those that more broadly pertain to things like poverty alleviation or homelessness or even municipal development. And many have been directly created by the city, but others have been community-led with significant city contribution. And in general, this policy framework has really been characterized by a strong commitment to community-based policy development and policy formation. And so what we've seen in the city is that this approach has served to build really strong community buy-in for our policy efforts and basically increase the likelihood that these policy directives will live beyond their political cycles. And that's something that we have really seen in the city with our policy set, that policies that were created a decade ago, despite changes in government or changes in economic situations, have still had a pretty long life cycle. So the creation of the Edmonton Coalition on Homelessness, or ECHO, in 1986, as well as the Edmonton Joint Planning Committee on Housing in 1990, were really foundational in establishing what we call the partnership era in Edmonton. So both of these organizations serve to provide long-term and formal outlets for collaboration and communication between diverse partners. So in the case of ECHO, the city first initiated a conversation on homelessness, basically recognizing that the city had a problem and they were not equipped to deal with it alone. They didn't have the financial resources or the expertise. So ECHO was a result of a conversation about that, and it came to have representation from over 100 agencies in our city. And keep in mind, this was in the late 80s, so before we even really had what we would kind of call the present homelessness crisis that we see in the city. And so ECHO was closely involved in municipal policy making, ensuring that housing advocates and all these various partners had a seat at decision-making tables, and to really provide a sort of unified voice from all these organizations within the city to work towards directives and policy. So to this day, ECHO does remain a very important policy advocate and partner in the city. The city is still involved, as well as various organizations. And then the Joint Planning Council was also established with the primary goal of bringing together government and private and community partners. And that was to basically determine what the priority needs were in the community and to set overall policy direction. And again, the city was an active member and supporter of this council. And so in addition to providing formal opportunities for collaboration, because these were groups that met quite often and had different events and were very active in policymaking and vision setting, they played a very important role in establishing this lasting culture of cooperation that we saw in the Edmonton housing sector. So a role that the city has pretty consistently maintained over the last several decades, and I think we've heard this from several other municipalities, is the role of lead coordinator and facilitator. So basically kind of overseeing, try to make partnerships between different organizations rather than trying to do everything ourselves. So the strong policy framework that we have in Edmonton really supported this role, essentially providing a roadmap upon which these partnerships and collaborations could be deliberately formed, and just setting direction. So this is a case study that kind of illustrates the novel partnership between the city and Capital Region Housing. In 2014, a key recommendation that came out of something called the Social Housing Regeneration Advisory Group, which was led by our mayor, Don Iveson, it encouraged the city to partner with social housing providers who were operating on city-owned land to develop pilot regeneration projects. So this recommendation in this report was basically the catalyst for a partnership between the city and Capital Region. And this started the first social housing regeneration project that we've had yet in Edmonton. And so once it's done, we just broke ground a couple weeks ago now. It's a little bit behind, unfortunately. But once it's done, it'll have an innovative new mixed income model that will allow people to stay in one place. So I think also Sarah mentioned earlier, this sort of punitive approach that we have right now under social housing regulation is somebody's income goes up past a threshold. Currently in community housing, we have to basically ask them to leave or evict them. So this new model will allow people to stay in place. They'll just shift into a different income category, but still be able to stay in the same building. So we're really excited about this new development. And I won't get into it too much more because Esther's presenting on this tomorrow, and we'll give you all the details. But this project also represents the first increase in targeted social housing units in Edmonton in nearly 30 years. And in this building, we tripled the number of affordable housing units from 80 to 240. So the city was the owner of the Londonderry Housing Complex, which was built in 1971. It was a city-owned building on city-owned land, and Capital Region Housing managed it at the time. So once it was determined that redevelopment was the most viable option for the site, basically the city acted to help out Capital Region in any way it could, providing administrative support or other things to be able to start the process of community engagement. And it was a pretty exciting time because the rezoning application went really well. There was no public opposition despite there being a tripling in the density. So it was very exciting. We basically, Capital Region approached the community with no pre-existing notions of what the building would look like other than the number of units that they wanted to see. Yeah, so like I said, we just broke ground on this, but it's an innovative partnership that the city helped sort of facilitate Capital Region Housing to take on. And then lastly, the influence of key people in Edmonton over the past several decades really can't be overstated. They have been really essential to building lasting relationships and an open line of communication in the sector, fostering trust, and also pushing for some pretty bold housing initiatives. So there have been a core group of city staff that were involved in policy creation and implementation. A lot of them recently retired, unfortunately, but I think there was some overlap with Christel. As well, we've been home to, or we've had a series of mayors and city councilors who've been really supportive of affordable housing, so that has definitely helped. Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk briefly about 3 of the key sort of initiatives that are happening right now. And I'll just start by saying, like, the seeds for a lot of what we're doing, the groundwork is laid by some of the conditions that we faced over the last couple of decades, and especially starting in the early 2000s when Alberta, like much of the rest of the country, was experiencing a really substantial economic boom, and it created an affordable housing crisis. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is our Affordable Housing Investment Guidelines, which is a city policy that was approved unanimously by Council in August of this year. And where the impetus for this came from is essentially, or some important context, I guess, for you to understand, is, as I mentioned, in the mid-2000s, Edmonton and the rest of the province was in a humongous boom. We had, tent city popping up in the middle of downtown Edmonton. I was working at the time at the Ledge for the opposition, and I was writing questions every day about the affordable housing crisis for my MLAs. And it was just a top of mind concern, and it was sort of a leading public opinion in terms of the top of mind issues. And so as a result, the provincial government, Premier Stelmach at the time, launched an affordable housing task force, which traveled the province, hearing from everybody about ideas about how to address the crisis. And the result of that was a historic investment on the part of the Government of Alberta, which was essentially a $1 billion investment in affordable housing in Edmonton over like a 5-year period, essentially. And, or a 3-year period. It all came really quickly. Anyways, so what happened in Edmonton, what we did is we received $110 million of that money directly to the City of Edmonton, and we matched it with $35 million of our own, and we launched a grant program called the Cornerstones Program. And so all of this came together really quickly, and as a result, so the city started giving out grants, sort of left, right, and center. The province at the time was also still directly funding things in Edmonton. And what happened was a lot of affordable housing development started happening really quickly. And a lot of it started going into the same communities because obviously affordable housing is often driven by land costs. And so, a lot of the providers were picking sites in sort of the central core neighborhoods around downtown or east of downtown. And what that created was a lot of tension in those communities. So we had a whole bunch of neighborhoods up in arms, like NIMBY was over the top sort of thing. And it ultimately I guess, culminated with our city council adopting something called the Non-Market Housing Investment Pause in 2012, which essentially said if the city was investing money in something for affordable housing, it would not be in any of these 5 neighborhoods. So these 5 neighborhoods were on pause. And the goal of this pause was to basically kind of hit the pause button, literally, and then to say essentially, build some trust with the neighborhoods and help them understand the rationale for this and that sort of thing. So in the context of that, in 2015, that was supposed to be a 3-year pause. In 2015, it came back up. Administration recommended that it be removed, and council said no, because the communities came back and they were still mad. And so it's sort of been this like indefinite weird thing hanging out there. And so the last time we took it to council, they said, we want to see what a citywide approach to this could look like before we talk about removing this investment pause. So the citywide approach is what we passed in August, and it's called policy C601. And what it is, I guess the other thing I'll just say is also with Cornerstones 1, when we got all that money from the province, we invested in and we built 3,500 units of basically near market rental in a very short period of time. But after that, we haven't had a big grant program. So we kind of did like some smaller investment programs like our secondary suites, and then we did like a bit of capital or land here or there, but we didn't have like a systematic approach. So this is about dealing with the pause, But even more importantly, it's about setting up a new program and a new approach to allow the city to continue to regularly invest and constantly be creating housing regardless of the political dynamics, essentially. So the policy, it will apply to most city investments in affordable housing. So if we're giving away land, if we're giving money, if we are looking at using our own surplus land and need to make a decision about whether it's appropriate for housing or not, those are sort of, if we're buying land, all these kinds of places where the city can intervene to help support affordable housing is where it will apply, with the exception of existing affordable housing or other programs that have their own policies, like our secondary suites or our surplus school site policy, which I'll talk about later. So just quickly, basically we've established 5 guidelines that the city will consider when we're looking at making investments. So the first is neighborhood affordable housing target and the community context, which is essentially how much affordable housing is already in the neighborhood. Is there none? Is there a lot, etc. The next is degree of housing affordability, so how deep is the subsidy and how long is the term. The third is funding from other sources, so obviously as a minor funding partner, we want to make, if there's money coming from other orders of government, we'll prioritize those as well. And then lastly, fourth is proximity to amenities and services, and that's really meant to prioritize supportive housing, like on-site supports will be really important there, but it also in this case mostly means transit, because we know from our user surveys that Capital Region does that that's the most important concern for people living in affordable housing. And then the last thing is overall project design, which is basically a catch-all to help us align to our funders, our senior orders of government funders. So things like accessibility and environmental sustainability will fall in there. To evaluate the neighborhood housing ratio, we need to set a target, and so to say, what is desirable. And so we set the target at 16%. And what that so we basically, with this policy, council has said all neighborhoods in Edmonton should have 16% affordable housing. And what that target is based on, it's evidence-based, tied to data, it's not political. It represents the number of households in core housing need in Edmonton currently, plus the existing inventory of affordable housing. So that number will change and fluctuate over time. Now, obviously, we don't have the resources to make this happen overnight. We are calling it a long-term aspirational goal, but it's important to note that it is, the other thing I will say too is not every neighborhood is going to have the same opportunity for affordable housing development, obviously. But where our new MDP, our municipal development plan, which is our new land use framework is going, is towards district planning. So once that's established, I think this target would be tied to districts instead of neighborhood by neighborhood, because a neighborhood is just too small of a unit of analysis, but we don't have anything else that is consistently covering the city except for wards, which are way too big. So the next thing I'll talk about really quickly is our affordable housing investment plan. So this was also approved unanimously by council just a week ago. I will say though it's still subject to approval through the budget process, which is about to happen in the next week or two. Well, I guess by mid-December it should be all figured out. So the city's approach with this plan is that our leadership is needed to set the conditions for success for our providers who are going to be building housing in Edmonton. And so we were moving from more of a hands-off approach to more of a proactive approach that is basically designed to attract more funding and investment and to support the creation of a pipeline of investment-ready projects that other orders of government can support. And the third thing that we're looking to do with this plan is to address local priorities, which include the geographic distribution of housing, like I just mentioned, and also more permanent supportive housing, which is a huge need in Edmonton. So under this plan, the city is setting a target of committing resources to support the development of 2,500 new units of affordable housing in the next 4 years. The way that these units will be spread across 5 priority investment areas. The first is permanent supportive housing, which, as Jolene mentioned in her portion of the presentation, there's a huge gap. We need close to 1,000 units. Edmonton has had considerable success and is quite honestly leading Canada in terms of its efforts to eliminate homelessness. In terms of homeless counts, we've reduced our homelessness by 45% since 2008. But what we're seeing now is the stickiness is the chronically homeless population, and that's becoming even more visible. And we had set a target initially in our first 10-year plan to end homelessness of 1,000 units, but we only built 200. And quite honestly, the city's focus on near market rental, because that was the demand, that was the affordable housing crisis at the time, was the working poor couldn't afford housing. I think we de-emphasized a focus on that, so this new plan is going to focus more on that. So we're devoting quite a bit of resources to it and are hoping to incent quite a bit of development there, obviously. The second area is our surplus school site redevelopment program, and I'll just quickly, surplus school sites, in Edmonton, in the 70s and 80s, we had this idea that every neighborhood would have a school. And obviously, when you're building single family homes, like the density is not there to support a school. So as a result, we have these sort of inner suburbs that have these large land chunks that have room for a school and all these sports fields around them. And so in early 2000s, during this crisis, the school boards in Edmonton surplused 40 of these sites. And essentially what they did was they gave them to it went back to the city because they were city land. And our council took a really brave step and basically said, these 40 sites that are in some of the richest neighborhoods in Edmonton that look like parks have sports fields on them, we're going to turn those into affordable housing. And so since that, we've been working to develop them. My colleague Tim, who's here, has almost finished developing 20 of them for the city's affordable homeownership program. And the other 20 have fallen to affordable housing. So 8 of them are going to be for seniors, and the remaining 9 or so will be for any mixed income affordable housing, essentially. So we're going to do 5 of those in the next 4 years is the plan. Next, or at least get those started. The next thing is affordable housing investment grants. This is just $10 million a year to our providers on a competitive basis. After that is our secondary suite grant program, which in Edmonton, we do a matching grant up to $25,000 for people to create secondary suites. In Edmonton, we allow secondary suites, garden suites, basement suites across all of our low density zones. So and they just made it legal in duplexes and triplexes. So we have about 11,000 suites now, and we're expecting to get another 2,000. And we've funded 800 in the past, and we're hoping to fund another 360 in the next 4 years. Lastly is our city-owned affordable housing inventory. This is like a weird catch-all for some contribution towards social housing regeneration, because as Jolene mentioned, the city owns 1,000 units of social housing that's not in great condition. And then also developer-sponsored affordable housing, which I'll talk about now. Oh, and these are the numbers for leverage. So the city can't do this on its own, obviously. We're going to put in $132 million, but the total construction cost of these units, according to our modeling, is about $509 million. And so we're going to need, in terms of equity from our partners and other orders of government, about $377 million to support these projects. How much time do I have?
I don't know, your phone turned off.
Am I over? Am I done? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I talked too long.
Really quickly, I'll just say really quickly, the city also has a really weak voluntary inclusionary policy that we started in the early 2000s. And it was actually, the city's a long history in this. In the 70s, we actually at one point took 40% of land for dedication at subdivision. That lasted for 3 years until the developers did that in court. This was our more recent attempt in early 2000, where we basically have a policy. It's called 585. In all of our negotiated zones that are custom zones, we put in a right to purchase 5% of units at 85% of market value. And that policy sucks, but it was all we could get because it was voluntary. Now we have a new thing in our MGA, so we're hoping, like Montreal, to renegotiate a new, at least if we don't get our reg, at least renegotiate a new voluntary policy. So we're currently reviewing that policy with the industry, and yeah, that's all I was going to mention here. So good.
Thank you.